So digital storytelling is the relatively new medium of having a story told through a digital portal, let's say a browser. It can also be an iPad or an iPhone, or it can be any number of media. But the key thing is digital, and I think what that means for me is it's a two-way story. The story is going to the viewer, but there's also something coming back to the story. And so that means that you can change that story, or you can influence it, or you can interact with it in some way. It makes for an interactive story. Yeah, I think the execution's changed. It is a paradigm shift. It is a fundamental change, just like the internet as a whole is a fundamental change in society, and as a result, storytelling. But I think that the change is much more about the technology that we apply to a story. So if you build a browser-based, let's say a film-based story, the ability to then jump to any part of the film, or to change the ending, or to include social information, that's the technology that you apply to a story. And that's a fundamental shift in how you tell that story. But the basic ingredients of a story, I think, are still the same. We have old, good storytelling when we are applying it to a very new medium. And that is revolutionary. It's just that it isn't the story that's changing necessarily. So I think that the big difference is that, as I said earlier, that the viewer can speak back to the story. How you let that influence the story, as a maker of content, how you let that influence what you are trying to say is up to you. You can make that as subtle, as detailed, or as profound and influential as you like. But there is a feedback there. And so the story, the journey of the story that you take changes in some form or another as you're watching it. I was thinking earlier about how does Facebook and Skype and Twitter and how do all these different channels influence us online. Now, I think nobody would doubt that there's a kind of an issue at the moment with attention span, with paying attention, with maybe following through on something without being interrupted by something else. At the same time, I really believe that a great story is going to capture you no matter what, no matter which medium it's in. And I've experienced that even online, even in YouTube, even in a low quality little window. I've been absolutely captivated by some stories. And it isn't just YouTube, also interactive stories. So I think that the question should be, are stories online good enough to capture their audience?
Are they?
Some are, but the majority of stories are not yet. And I think there's several reasons for that. It isn't about quality, or it isn't about trying to compare some people's work compared to other people's work. There's a huge amount of experimentation going on about what this medium can do with stories and how different people play with that. And some some experiments will do better than others, will capture more people than others. Some will follow more traditional processes. Maybe the writing is stronger, therefore it captures more people. And others will invent a whole different way of bringing a story to viewers, and will really excite them. Not every experiment is going to work. With a large audience, I mean. Not everything will be a great way of telling a story in an interactive form. But there's a huge amount of experimentation happening, and that's exciting. Stories, in the end, are what capture people for longer periods of time. It's why we go to a cinema. You make a massive amount of effort to go to a cinema. I said that before at a talk. That's an important question. How much effort people make to see a film? There must be some effort to go online and watch a story once people can get a sense that there's a payoff and there's a reward to do that. Stella Artois are doing some great work. I'm very proud of having worked on the Black Diamond, for example. Beyond that, maybe the Swedish Hero project was an absolutely wonderful example of the simplest of touches, where a little tiny bit of interaction, meaning you upload a photograph, fundamentally changes the meaning of a piece of work. It was obviously widely shared, so I thought that was wonderful. More recently, along the same lines, Take This Lollipop is something I've seen it actually shared on my Facebook wall, and I don't see that very often. People were genuinely freaked out by it, so it was very powerful. If you go away from the branded campaign, there's a wonderful project by Vincent Morissette called Blah Blah, which I think is gorgeous. And then there's a documentary called Journey to the End of Coal, which was made, I believe, by Honky Tonk Films in Paris. And that really, when I saw that a couple of years ago, it changed the way that I think of a browser. That changed the browser from an information space to an entertainment space in my mind. It made me go, yes, it's possible. The web is an incredibly fractured space. It's a space that is about niche pockets of interest, niche pockets of mechanics. My personal interests in terms of, let's say, directions of storytelling, I'm very interested in the interactive documentary scene. I think that in the last year, it's the work that's coming out of that scene, it has proven that you can do long-form storytelling, genuinely interesting storytelling, over anything more than the duration of a commercial. Let's say 30 seconds, 1 minute. If you begin talking about a 30-minute or 1 hour interactive story, at the moment the only people doing it are the interactive documentary makers. It's very impressive. And on the other side of the sort of room, all the way on the opposite end of things, you've got the processing scene, the art and code world. There are some really interesting people, friends and also people that I just admire from a distance, working in that, and they are making art through code a legitimate force, and not just online, but also going out of the browser, going out of the internet space, and in the real world. There's the combination of the real world and the web as a medium, and it's the art and code people that are doing that. The moment that interactive story telling as a medium, the moment that interactive storytelling becomes as good as the classic forms of storytelling, will be an important moment. I don't think that's happened yet. I don't think we have made anything in a digital context that can rival the top 10 best books ever written and the top 10 best films ever made. So if that's what we are comparing it to, if those are the fundamental pillars of a kind of cultural society, well then the web is a long way behind. But you know, we are just in our infancy. We are exploring and experimenting with a new medium, and I think the first step in making it more close to home would be to get people to believe that the browser can also be host to a real story. Is expectation of what the browser means for people. People go to the cinema to watch a story. People come online to read the news, check their Facebook, and see emails. The moment that in that list we can include also watch a story, then we can really start to make content for an audience. Instead of content that lives and breathes, but it's a bit more hit and miss right now. A good story is bigger than the technology. At the same time, the technology is what is making it different. It's what is changing the story. Stories will continue, and interactively, I don't think fundamentally the technology will influence how you tell an interactive story. You have to rebuild it for every technology, in the same way that an iPad app needs to be fundamentally rebuilt to be launched as an Android app. There's a technological shift there. The discussion about Flash and HTML5 is a very topical one right now. There's a big shift there, and I think that a lot of people don't mind so much which one of the two their story is built in, if it's a great story. You can rebuild most Flash-based stories as HTML5 stories. Then you start to get into a very complex discussion about compression settings, load times, browser compatibility, the details of what makes Flash as good as it is at creating complex interactive stories. Those are the details that separate the two technologies, but at the same time an audience out there doesn't really care. The story is the key thing that engages people, and the platforms upon which that story is built, I think that's the problem for people making it, and it's a throwaway problem because the story will keep you hooked. The technology is just a vehicle. I think the most important thing to avoid is not dealing with the boring small details first, because there are many boring small details. I mentioned some of them earlier. Again, compression is maybe the thing that will make the most impact on the final overall experience of your online story. But it's one of those things you don't really want to spend much time on. especially early on in the film. And yet if you don't, and your project is fundamentally built around one set of compression, you won't really be able to make it different later. There's this difficult thing where you get to a point in a process of making your film or making your website when it's too late to change things. And it's only after that point that you can see what was the perfect way to build it in the first place. That's the thing to avoid. It's so difficult to say that it's a book, you know, as opposed to an answer. I think there's many paths opening up right now. The future starts with people just trying and experimenting and playing, and audiences can give feedback now in a way that they were never able to before, with blogs and with comments. So filmmakers, interactive filmmakers, can learn from that. So there's much more communication between everyone to try to figure out what's the most powerful way to tell interactive stories. People were making interactive stories all the way in the 50s. Funny enough, there was an American film producer called William Castle who had this idea of having sort of cards held up in the cinema that allowed the audience together to vote for a different, one of two different endings of a film. In the end, he actually fooled his audience because he only had one ending prepared. And therein lies the problem really of open-ended storytelling, because every ending needs to be filmed. The amount of work that you make if you have a truly open-ended film doubles, quadruples, and much, much more. Interactive storytelling is such an intense process. I think the future, though, can be summed up quite simply in whatever the technology brings, whatever we end up trying to play around with and experiment with, the future is better stories. The future is people that make the kind of stories that make you cry for an interactive web-based story. It's the scriptwriters who are from a cinema background, making content for the browser.